Welcome, friends, to the first session of Central Philadelphia Meeting's Quakerism 101 course in 2020 to 2021. This session is in our usual time slot of fourth Sunday afternoon of the month, and we'll be looking at Quaker history in this session. We have sessions planned on other essentials of Quaker faith and practice that will start in or resume again in October. I'll talk about those, I think, at the end. Our goal is to, with this session, is to provide a kind of primer on Quaker history. We're going to attempt the ridiculous task of covering 370 years worth of Quaker history in an hour, or maybe an hour and a quarter. It'll be a little different than our adult religious education programs usually are, in that there's going to be a little more presentation than usual. I think we'll probably do something like an hour to an hour and a quarter, Greg and I back and forth. And then we'll have a time after that for questions and answers and discussion for at least 45 minutes. We plan to end at 3. And let's see, what else might be useful to cover? Greg, do you have any, have I missed something? You're muted, Greg.
We have a lot to cover, and I'm gonna just let you start, and I'll pitch in when I get there.
Okay, we thought, because this is a kind of a study course, and we've offered friends a reading list that they could have read ahead of time if they wanted to, and plan to do so for all the other sessions. We thought we would start by having some introductions, brief though, because we do have a lot to do. We thought we would ask everybody, we have 17 people, so let's say a maximum of a minute to talk about what it is you're hoping to get from the Quakerism 101 course. And to keep things going smoothly, I think I'll just call out names from the participation panel list so that we get to everybody in an orderly fashion. And if you aren't ready to answer or don't want to, you can just say pass. So top of my list would be Laurent.
I wanted to have an experience similar to what I had when I attended Quakerism 101 at Pendle Hill with Ben Dandelion a few years ago. I learned a lot about history and different perspectives, because different people would come in with different things. It's a little bit sometimes like reading your blog, Steve. You know, you combine different perspectives, and so that's what I'm hoping to get, is a good you know, review.
Anna?
Hi, I'm sorry. I'm still having lunch. I'm really sorry.
you want to come back to you later?
Yeah, please. I'm sorry.
Okay. Don't let me forget. Arlene.
I'm just curious to be here and take part in it, see what I can learn. And also I have a particular interest in Jessica, Hunter, and Anna as people whom I don't know. And I just think it's so terrific to have some newer people in their involvement in the meeting involved in this. And I'm really grateful for that and particularly since we're not meeting in person, I'm looking forward to this opportunity to get to know each of the three of you more fully, as well as continue my relationships with all the rest of you who I've known for a long time. And Joseph also, I mean, I don't think of Joseph as new anymore, but newer, and having the chance to connect with him as well is great.
Helene?
Hi, everybody. I'm Helene. I was asked to be a co-leader for the next session, so I want to meet you all and make sure that our session next time is relevant.
Esther?
Pass.
Hunter?
Hi, so I am looking forward to this. I went to one of the ARE courses early this year, back when we were still meeting in the meeting house, and just thought it was really interesting. I was also at Greg's reading from his book. Both those things were really interesting, and I, got a lot out of it, hoping to do more of the same. Also, a good opportunity to meet all you guys as well. So thank you, Arlene.
Jessica?
Hello. I have been attending meeting for about a year now and have found it really a blessing. And so through this course, I'm hoping to just learn more about the foundation so I can deepen my own understanding.
Joseph?
I pass for right now.
Kate?
I did quite a bit of independent study in high school on early friends. And as I've listened, well, often to you, Steve, saying what George Fox really meant, and now I'm reading Vanessa's wonderful Fit for Freedom, Not for Friendship, and I'm realizing that some of my perspectives were quite askew, and I like to find out. I like to correct my misunderstandings. So I'm really excited. And may I interject one thing, Steve? You had mentioned about a few weeks ago about George Fox walking cheerfully over the earth, meaning over the problems of the earth. And that really was in my heart at 8:30 worship this morning.
Margot? You're muted, Margot.
Hi, everybody. I'm Margot Tassi, and in this history section, I think I'm interested in how the early Quaker theology fit in with the historical times, the connection between George Fox and his followers and what was going on in England at that time. And I'm very curious to learn about how you bring it up to date to today. Thanks.
Marianne, who could be teaching this course, I think. You're muted, Marianne.
Well, I am not good on history, so I'm looking forward to learning a lot.
Paul?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, the more I can learn, the better. I know we run into a lot of people that don't know much about Quakerism. They're always trying to get a short, concise summary, and that's not always easy to give. We visited the North England area, and we're fascinated by some of the original stomping grounds of George Fox, because I had a dear friend, Mike, who passed away recently, but lived there for many years. And that was a nice connection. And then the other thing I guess I'm interested in is how we ended up with such different ways of worship, where there's program versus unprogrammed meeting.
Rita.
Well, I asked the spirit this morning and the spirit said, move, do it. That's one reason. And other reasons are I'm learning so much about Quaker history from different people who share stories about it lately that it's absolutely fascinating. And I also love the community and I want the connections. And so there are many reasons.
Bob.
I have to unmute myself. I'm Robert Sutton, Bob Sutton, and I'm interested in reviewing some of the things that maybe I thought I knew but didn't really know very well, and to learn more about Quaker organizational history that I'm not very familiar with, and understand more of the differences within the Quaker movements.
Stephanie, did we do you yet?
I am looking forward to a review and to learning some new things.
And Yoko.
Oh, I will pass this time. Thank you.
So back to you, Anna.
So I think I identify with Jessica. I really want to have a solid understanding, a foundational understanding as someone who is just now getting to know just getting this foundational understanding.
And Joseph, I think had passed. You still want to pass again, Joseph, or do you want to speak now?
It's still a pass for me.
Did I miss anybody?
Yoko?
Yeah, Yoko, you want to pass again?
Yes.
Okay. Well then, thank you. I heard two specific historical themes that some friends wanted to focus on. Margot wanted us to give her some of the context for the rise of the Quaker movement in 17th century England, and a couple of people mentioned the history of the various branches of Quakerism. So we'll try to make sure we cover that stuff. And I think it's time to start. We'll start with Greg, who's going to do what I just said, look at the origins of the Quaker movement in the 17th century.
All right, good. It's a very confusing time of the 17th century. We speak of Quakerism as a rising in 1650, and that's the decade I'm going to focus on. Until a century earlier, the UK, United Kingdom, like all of, or most of Western Europe, had been Roman Catholic. Henry VIII, in about 1540, changed that, of course, to the Church of England. A little matter of trying to divorce a barren wife, and the Pope wouldn't let him. So suddenly England was Protestant, but it was still hierarchical and ritualistic like Catholicism. They were both very heavy with administration, a real top-down sort of religion. First you had the Pope and then the King, and their authority was absolute. But in the 1640s, we have the English Civil War, also called the Puritan Revolution. In 1649, Charles I, the king, was beheaded for treason. His treason seemed to be that he was showing a lot of sympathy for Catholicism. So then there was a decade, the one we're interested in, of an interregnum led by the Puritan Oliver Cromwell. As I say, it was a very confusing time for Christians. Now there was no top-down control, really. And there was a deep yearning in England to go back to primitive Christianity with all these dogmas and administrative layers. The Puritans, by their very name, claimed that that's what they were doing. They were purifying the religion, and they did do away with several layers of bureaucracy. But they were heavily influenced by Scots Presbyterians, which had its own set of controls. In other words, what they call synods and paid clergy, and a very heavy dogmatic theology called predestination. You were damned or you were saved, and there was nothing you could do. It fit a little too well with the class system. You know, if you're born to an earl, you're a nobleman. If you're born to a peasant, you're always a peasant. And there were movements at that time, not just religious movements, but there were levelers. Those who were religious were looking for a more spontaneous church. And so at the opposite extreme of this religious structure, there were several groups which were really anarchic. The one I like to talk about is the ranters. The name says it all. Imagine a meeting for worship where a dominant personality could rant about noisy children or could praise drunken parties as the real meaning of life and the things we should be engaged in. There were others called Muggletonians, Fifth Monarchists, and so on. I'm not going to get into those. But then there was this new group, the Friends of Jesus, one of the names they had. They became known as Quakers, and that's a story I won't get into. And they were in the middle. They were moderate. Then as now, there was no visible hierarchy. Each person was a minister with a license to speak. But there is governance, and today we understand that by the concept of the sense of the meeting. So a minister, is true, may go off on a tangent in a Quaker meeting, but they really tend not to rant, and we found ways to keep it from being Quakerism, from being anarchic. So as this middle road, perhaps, and I'm guessing here, it became appealing, it began to take hold. One man was considered most responsible, the founder, or named the founder, George Fox, but he was only one of many memorialized in that time as the Valiant 60, and there were more than 60. Very dedicated friends. His wife, Margaret Fell Fox, is also celebrated. A man named James Naylor is well known. And I want to mention Mary Fisher. She went to Turkey to convert the Sultan. She had no luck, but you have to admire her dedication. In any case, Fox was the most brilliant, probably, and the most persistent. He walked all over England, preaching, being jailed, being beaten up for his beliefs. I'll mention also that he went to Europe to try to convert people in Holland and Germany. I mention that because he was accompanied by our William Penn at that time. Now, I'm going to guess at some reasons why Quakerism has endured while the others of the anarchic sort folded. And one is their talk of the Lamb's War, which is from the book of Revelations. Now, of course, lambs don't go to war. Jesus was a lamb. And their weapon was the word, as Steve says, with a capital W. And they won over by example. And if you're fighting a lamb's war, you just, when you're persecuted, you just take it, you suffer. You persist despite attacks. We've seen that relived in modern times with the work of Gandhi and M.L. King. Another appealing factor of Quakers was their lack of dogma. There's a famous letter from the elders of Balby, or the Balby Advice, written in 1656. I think of it as the basis for what we call the testimonies, because it was full of advice and not doctrine. Here's some wording from it. Dearly beloved friends, these things we do not lay upon you as a rule or form to walk by, but in other words, end of quote, for guidance. And the best known line is probably, these are things that may be fulfilled in spirit, not in the letter, for the letter killeth, but the Spirit giveth life. That may have been why Quakers were thriving in those days, but then came a very big upset in 1660, the restoration of Charles II, the son of Charles I. It put all these new religions in a difficult position. After 1 decade, they were back under absolute control, and they had to be careful. And this may account for that wonderful Quaker statement of pacifism, and I'm going to end this part of our talk with. It's a way of saying to King Charles II, we're no threat. I'm going to read this part of it that's I find so inspiring. Quote, we utterly deny all outward wars and strife and fightings with outward weapons for any end or under any pretense whatsoever. And this is our testimony to the whole world. The Spirit of Christ, by which we are guided, is not changeable, so as once to command us from a thing as evil and again to move unto it. And we do certainly know, and so testify to the world, that the Spirit of Christ, which leads us into all truth, will never move us to fight and war against any man with outward weapons, neither for the kingdom of Christ, nor for the kingdoms of this world. The entire statement is on a sign outside Abington Meeting, if you're ever up in that neighborhood. It's been a very great struggle for Quakers to maintain that position, but in any case, that strikes me as being very important to us. Now I'm going to end this, my segment here by saying there's some background reading which you may know about, or Steve has pointed out, which is more authoritative than what I've given you. The Brinton book. Also, those of you who have faith and practice, I hope you all do, pages 80 to 86 has a historical background which you can look at. Steve, can I turn it back to you?
I want to fill in a couple of corners in what Greg had just presented. The first is about the Puritans. When Bloody Mary took the throne and tried to turn England back towards Catholicism, a whole bunch of the reformists fled England and they went to Geneva. And there they were radicalized by the Calvinists in Geneva. And when Elizabeth took the throne and returned England to the Church of England, she brought them back again. She invited them back again and installed them as essentially the new hierarchy of the Church of England to a large degree. And it was, that's how the Puritans sort of got their start, but they couldn't get the Church of England to change as much as they wanted it to. And this was the impulse behind the Civil War. Moving forward a little bit, in the 1640s, one of the groups that Greg was referring to was a group called the Seekers. Seekers were a loose movement, not really an organization, but groups of people, especially located in the north of England, who had tried everything and didn't like what they saw. They basically gave up on the Church of England and all of the alternatives that were growing up at the time. And their radical solution to the problem they faced, which was exactly the same problem that George Fox faced, which was he went around interviewing religious people of all sorts and going to all kinds of churches, and nothing worked for him. They decided that the only thing they could do was simply to wait and hope in faith that the Holy Spirit would come to them and show them which way to go. In 1652, Fox, on his wanderings, climbed Pendle Hill in, I think it's Yorkshire. This very tall hill that had a long history of witchcraft, interestingly. And on Pendle Hill, he had a vision of a great people to be gathered, is the way he describes it in his journal. And a few weeks later, we find him joining a group of seekers, a couple of thousand, I think, in a place called Furbank Fell in the northwest of England. And after a several-hour-long sermon, this group of seekers decided this was what they had been waiting for. And in a sort of Pentecost moment, the Quaker movement began with just exactly as it had in the book of Acts, where several thousand were converted by the disciples preaching. Several thousand of these seekers decided that Fox's message of the light of Christ was the answer that they'd been looking for. I want to lay out a kind of schematic outline of Quaker history and then get into a little more detail. Quaker history breaks itself down very nicely, oddly enough, into 4 phases that start at around the turn of each century, with transition periods that straddle the turn of the century. And the first transition period, Greg has referred to already, which was the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. Each of these transition periods has external forces and internal forces that combine to change Quaker culture in a dramatic way. The external forces that, and the transition period that straddles the 18th century starts really around 1661 and ends around 1695 or so. The external force was intense persecution of the Quakers. In reaction to the Restoration, one of these radical groups called the Fifth Monarchy Men staged a riot in England that evolved into an abortive coup attempt. They seized the House of Parliament and held it for several days. And the reaction was swift and severe. And one of the things the authorities either didn't really care or didn't really know the real differences between all these various dissenter groups. More than 4,200 Quakers got swept up in the arrests that followed the put down of the Fifth Monarchy Revolution. Many of the leaders of the movement at that time, including George Fox, entered prison, and many of them never came out. William Penn has said that we can be thankful for the tremendously robust physical presence of George Fox for the existence of the Quaker movement, because he survived several imprisonments under the really dreadful conditions of the prisons of the time. He was just about the only leader to come out of prison after this first wave of arrests. And he realized that things had changed and began a process that was the internal forces that changed Quaker culture, which he called bringing gospel order to friends. And by that, what he meant was creating the meeting structure system that we have today. It's a little different in England than it is in America. There, it's called local meetings, monthly meetings, and general meetings, whereas we have just monthly meetings and regional meetings. He also created women's meetings for business and clarified the difference between the kinds of business they did. The women took care of more pastoral care matters. One of the main reasons for creating these meetings was to organize the distribution of financial support to those who were being arrested and jailed. Meanwhile, Parliament passed a whole bunch of laws, collectively known as the Clarendon Code, after the, I think the chief of the exchequer, I think was named Clarendon. These laws made it literally illegal to be a Quaker. And they limited all kinds of other things. Religious meetings, more than 5 people were, unless you were the Church of England, were against the law. They required oaths of loyalty for doing just about anything. And the result was a horrific economic assault on the Quaker movement. Friends were getting busted for just about anything, and they never stopped doing the things that they were told to stop doing. So they were constantly being jailed, they were constantly being fined, and if a family didn't have the money to pay a fine, then they suffered what's called distrainment, which was seizure of property to pay for the fine. And the Friends started off as a movement, as 2 classes of people: yeoman farmers, that is to say, freehold farmers, people who owned their own farms and had no economic or political relationship with the manorial system. They weren't serfs. And small town tradespeople. And most of the farmers were also pastoralists. They also usually sheep. We're talking about especially up in the north of England, which is where the movement really was strongest at the time. So the distrainments often included the seizure of their tools. So a movement made up of mostly farmers and small traders ended up being fined into poverty, having their livelihoods seized from them, and thrown in jail. And it drove them off the land. And since they were already into sheep and already had connections with the wool markets, and even with other aspects of the wool industry, which was sort of the backbone of the mercantile economy of England at the time, they went into business through the contacts that they had, and they became wool merchants, especially wholesalers. So there was this tremendous demographic shift from the land into commerce, forced by the persecutions. I want to give you a sense of how intense the persecutions were for a moment. A yearly income, livable income for a modest family was £40 a year.
Okay.
Before 1700, in tithe fines alone, that is, failure to pay the tithe that supported the Church of England, the state collected £1,125,000 from Quakers, when £40 would keep you alive for a year. The Conventicle Act alone in 15 years brought in £48,000 in addition to that. Between 1700 and 1829, £903,000. And the paradox is that after this intense economic drain on the movement, by 1700, Quakers emerged as the second wealthiest community in England, behind the landed aristocracy. 70% of the Quakers in 1700 form, let me say that, start over. 70% of Quakers by then were in the most prosperous class, and 70% of England was in the working class. A complete transformation in the fortunes of Friends. because they had been at the bottom at the beginning. They were the Bill Gateses of the Industrial Revolution and the evolution of industrial capitalism in Great Britain. They built the infrastructure that industrial capitalism needed to get going. But there was a price to pay. They had to cut a deal with the state. You leave us alone, and we'll leave you alone. Doug Gwynn talks about this in The Covenant Crucified, his book. William Penn had won a landmark case guaranteeing religious freedom to the dissenting sects, including Quakers. And so that pushed religion into the private sphere and out of the public sphere. And Quakers stopped being the revolutionaries and in the face of the social system of the time that they had been during the Lamb's War, with their hat honor and they're interrupting church services to preach and so on. And Quakers withdrew into themselves. They withdrew, I like to think of the 18th century as a double culture period. They withdrew from every aspect of society in Great Britain except that of commerce and science. In these areas, they were utterly dominant. I'm going to breeze through some of their contributions to industrial capitalism just very briefly. There's so much more detail here, but it's just we don't have time for it. They were innovators, especially technological innovators. Their most famous innovation was the price tag. They believed that there was a true price, a fair price for anything, and that you shouldn't deviate from it. So they posted it. This was to cover your costs and provide for a modest profit. This meant that you could go to a Quaker merchant and know exactly how much you were going to pay instead of having to barter for it. This completely changed retail commerce almost overnight. They were leaders in developing the industrial tooling, materials, and technologies that the Industrial Revolution required. The most important having to do with revitalizing the iron industry, perfecting cast iron, and then developing for the first time cast steel. Cast steel meant that a machine mass produces goods. Cast steel made it possible to mass produce machines. It was an exponential growth in the output capacity of the economy. They were essential to the development of the kind of industrial strength transport that this new economy required. They invented the railroad. They invented a new kind of steel bridge that could hold a locomotive and its train without collapsing. They invented new forms of energy. They invented coppice forestry, which means basically you replant the trees that you burn when you're trying to make iron. They developed, they became bankers. Lloyd's of London was the very first bank to diversify its holdings and not just be a clearinghouse for a particular industry. They got into venture capital. They supported the development of the steam engine when Watt was against the ropes with his funding. They developed industrial organizations, based on the guild model, so that there were iron industry associations. They built whole new industries. They provided all of the silver for the crown for 150 years. They were heavy into silver, zinc, and lead mining in particular. And they invented the consumer economy, starting with Huntsman's steel cutlery. Until the middle 18th century, you ate with a spoon, a dish, and bread. Huntsman invented the table fork and the table knife. And suddenly we're eating with knives and forks. And the growing middle class of all these people who are making money off of industry become consumers. And Quakers developed all these industries that provided the goods that were replacing servants in the household in this growing middle class. There's two areas in which that account for this tremendous success, but I can't get into the details. They have to do with the nature of Quaker character and the nature of Quaker culture. The cultural side is especially important, and it has to do with the networks of traveling ministers. And there's a great quote that I love to pass on about this from Benjamin Franklin. He said, you go to a tavern and everybody's drinking and they're playing games and they're having fun and they're laughing and they're socializing, and the Quakers are in the corner discussing the price of wheat. Spiritually, this was a time of what has often been called quietism, a reliance on the Holy Spirit for just about everything, as opposed to the hierarchy of the church, or even the preached word that was dominant in the Church of England and the Puritans before that. There's a whole background to that in the Anabaptist movement on the continent, but we don't have time to get into that. I'm bringing up these things we're not getting into in case people have questions later. In the meantime, of course, Pennsylvania gets going. Penn's father had loaned the crown a lot of money. And Charles II decided the way he was going to pay this debt off, because he didn't have the money, was to give Penn, William Penn, the charter to a vast tract of land in the New World.
Which he, of course, didn't actually own. But...
Was that a question? I thought I heard somebody speak. So in the 1680s, to get away from the persecutions and because there was opportunity, Quakers began leaving England in droves to move to Pennsylvania. There's a lot more to say about Pennsylvania, but it's not my special area, and I suspect that Greg knows more. And so if people have questions about that, we can come back to it. The next transition is a sort of minor transition. Well, it has really important influences on Quaker culture, and that is the rise of evangelicalism at the end of the 18th century. It takes hold in Quaker circles immediately, and by the middle of the 19th century, is a dominant force in England. British Quakerism is essentially an evangelical movement, and very strong in parts of North America. And I think this is a point at which I hand off to Greg again to talk about the divisions that took place in the 19th century.
All right, thanks, Steve. There were three major splits in American Quakerism, and the results are still with us. So we now have four branches of Quakerism, and I'll get to those in a minute. It all began at the Arch Street Meeting House in 1827. This was another confusing time. The burnt over period, it was called, when there was a great deal of religious fundamentalism or evangelicalism sweeping the country. And the Quakers were under pressure from Christian sects who say, well, you say you're Christian. What about the Bible as the word of God? What about the divinity of Christ? And so on. The Quakers historically and to a degree currently did not accept the Bible as the final word. We have our ongoing belief in continuing revelation. So the evangelicals were after the Quakers to get with the program. And the Quakers began to yield, to budge a bit. And this led to a rather raucous split in 1827. It's in part doctrinal, but it wasn't all doctrinal. There were various factors, and I'm going to read a bit from the text that I had Steve send you. Geography contributed. In the early 1820s, as throughout its previous history, PYM comprised a region of thousands of square miles, still without the easy access from outlying areas to the hub that trains would later bring. For country friends, traveling to Philadelphia remained arduous, expensive, and rare. City friends necessarily saw to the administrative tasks of the yearly meeting. They dominated the major committees and offices, overseeing the work of the society. I'm going to read on a bit more and I have to interrupt myself to explain something, but whether by intent or accident, city men consolidated their control to the exclusion of country friends. The all-powerful Meeting for Sufferings and the Meeting for Sufferings was literally established in the 18th century to deal with the sort of persecution that Steve has mentioned as inflicted on friends. The all-powerful Meeting for Sufferings consisted of 40 men assigned by quota for each of the quarters. But because friends from central Pennsylvania, southern Delaware, or the New Jersey shore could not be expected to make the frequent meetings, city friends were appointed to represent their interests. These were lifetime appointments. When a member died, the meeting replaced him with another friend drawn from the city ranks. Well, you can imagine the resentment if you're from Upper Susquehanna Valley and somebody like a factory owner from Society Hill is representing your interests. And there were other fissures. Another was slavery. And again, it was partly rural, urban. The rural folks were adamant again about the end of slavery. The city folks, particularly the bourgeois, you might say, the store owners and so on, didn't want their supply lines interrupted. And they were a little ambivalent about slavery. As Kate mentioned the book by our member Vanessa July, Fit for Freedom, Not for Friendship. The city friends would expostulate vehemently about slavery, but they wouldn't let Black folks into the meeting as members. And they didn't want their supply lines upset. So there was a bit of a fissure there. And there was a third thing. One of the local meetings was actually full of working class folks who had their own resentments of people like Jonathan Evans and Samuel Bettle, who were the leaders of the Arch Street meeting. So in 1827, there was this episode of Quakers behaving very badly. Arch Street was at that time also a burial ground, the meeting house. And if you were a member of the renegade faction, which was the Hicksites, as they were called, you were not allowed to be buried there. There were all sorts of, there were fights and so on. The leader of the traditionalists was Elias Hicks, a New York Quaker, who came to Philadelphia often and was pretty much, he gave his name then to the movement of those who opposed the more, those group Quakers moving towards Christianity away from the old traditional Quaker viewpoint. This split lasted until 1855 when they realized there weren't that many doctrinal differences. And I've sent you a reference to the book Quakers in Conflict by Larry Engel, a wonderful story of the split. And he says the doctrinal differences were really minor compared to everything else.
It's 1955.
Did I say 1955? Okay. So 128 years this split lasted. All right, the second split was sort of followed on the first one. Up in New England, there was a traditional Quaker named John Wilbur, who led Quakers in their traditional beliefs, and these included social matters like plain speech. You've heard about thee and thou, and first day and first month, and so on. And there were others influenced by the English, particularly John Gurney, who were thinking that Quakers should have seminaries and train ministers and so on. So they split and found some of them, the Gurneyites, so to speak, went over towards a semi-programmed meeting style. And I'll come back to what's grown out of that. In a sense, you had the extreme Hicksites versus the Orthodox. So ultimately, there were four branches. I'm sorry, the third split was in Indiana in 1873, in which the breakaway group went totally to the church model and became evangelical. So that you ended up with what we call Friends General Conference. This is sort of the outgrowth of Hicksitism. They're traditional Quakers, but not clinging to old social ways like plain speech and so on. You have the semi-programmed groups, which are located mostly in the Midwest, which are called Friends United Meeting. You have a few conservative groups that are located in the states of Iowa, Ohio, and North Carolina. And finally, you have evangelical friends who are most often associated with the West, in Oregon, for example. You've heard about all the Quakers in Latin America and Africa, and it's true the biggest branch of Quakerism today is the evangelicals. Well, they obviously were converted by the missionaries that the evangelical friends sent out, because Quakers traditionally, after Fox's day, stopped proselytizing. Okay, for the Indiana split, I have one other bit of reading that I would suggest, and I will give you the reference later if you ask about it. Thomas Ham, Transformation of American Quakerism. My own book about the Arch Street Meeting House includes a chapter, and that's what you have, a chapter in your, you have a copy online. Okay, I think that's it for now.
I want to fill in another couple of corners in this development of Quakerism in the 19th century. Especially in Great Britain, the evangelical culture of British Quakerism in the 19th century drew them into society, the wider society, in ways that had not been taking place in the 18th century during the so-called Quietist period. Friends became interested in Bible societies, distributing Bibles, and they became very involved in the abolition movement in Great Britain. The Philadelphia Yearly Meeting I had as a yearly meeting, I think, finally decided to write a minute against slavery sometime in the middle of the 18th century. Decades after John Woolman had begun his abolitionist efforts in the 1710s and 20s, I think it was. But in 1832 it was, Great Britain finally made slavery illegal and ended the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, basically. And Friends played a large role in this. And they also became the backbone of a new approach to social problems, which we call philanthropy. The kind of thing you see in Dickens's A Christmas Story. We led the way as a movement in setting up funds and organizations to minister to the poor in various different ways, which became the signature social outreach platform for Victorian upper and middle classes. And on a separate angle altogether, I want to drop in just a little bit on the relationship between Friends and the indigenous peoples of North America. In the 1790s, Corn Planter, who was the chief of the Seneca people at the time, sent his two oldest sons to Philadelphia to be tutored by Quakers. And he asked Philadelphia Meeting to send missionaries to, quote unquote, teach agriculture and the industrial art and the American arts. I think that's the way he put it. 3 young men left Philadelphia Yearly Meeting and spent quite a long time, years, I don't think it was decades, years anyway, into the 19th century, teaching the Seneca people and whoever else in the Longhouse Confederacy would listen. The Longhouse Confederacy being the Mohawks, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, the Seneca, and the Tuscarora. Teaching them how to farm on the American model, which involved horse and plow agriculture. Until then, the Longhouse people had always been the men hunt and the women farm. This revolution in agricultural practice disempowered the women because they didn't have the strength, they couldn't master this plow and horse agricultural technique, and it disempowered the men. It made them farmers. It made them women instead of hunters. And it turned Iroquois culture on its head. And at the same time, Corn Planter's brother, who was a serious alcoholic, fell into a coma in, I think, 1810 maybe, and had a vision. And when he came out, he continued to have visions. He sobered up and he started a new religious movement that was heavily influenced by Quaker teachings called the Handsome Lake Revival. His name was Handsome Lake. And so there is still today followers of the Handsome Lake religion in Iroquois country. Because of a long-standing peaceful relationship, even during the Revolutionary War, of Quakers, especially in New York State, with the Iroquois combatants. The Mohawks had sided with the British, but the Seneca had sided with the Americans. When Grant became president, Grant had a personal secretary who was a Mohawk. His personal secretary was a Mohawk man. And this personal secretary, his name was Elias Parker, I think, talked Grant into appointing Quakers as his, in a new post that he created of Indian agent in Indian country. And so there suddenly became a whole bunch of Quakers moving out into Indian country in the West, in the far West, to manage the federal relationship with the tribes that had been relocated to the West. A number of schools, Quaker schools, got started, and I believe there's still one school in Choctaw country somewhere in, I think it's Alabama, being run by Quakers. I'm going to try to wrap up by 1/4 here, so I'm going to cruise on. The second major transition starts around 1887 and ends with the Friends World Conference in 1920. All these separations that Greg talked about, the tensions between these communities never really abated in the 19th century. They wouldn't receive each other's ministers. They wouldn't accept each other's epistles. And in the late 1860s, young adult friends became very frustrated with the culture of eldership in their Quaker meetings. A bunch of old men basically ran everything. And the many meetings were going sometimes for years without vocal ministry. The number of vocal ministers who were being recorded declined steadily from the 1700s into the 19th century. It became harder and harder to become a minister, and there was less and less ministry, and it was less and less relevant. It was just formulaic evangelical calls to repentance most of the time. And meanwhile, all the slave culture, especially in North Carolina, had gotten so bad for friends in the 1820s and 30s and 40s that a great migration began of American friends out of the slave South into the West. They settled first in Richmond, Indiana, for two reasons. The first was the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, which was a treaty that most friends believed had been legally and fairly entered into with the tribes of Ohio and Indiana and Illinois to cede their land and move peacefully to what we now call Oklahoma. Friends believed that treaty was a fair one. And so they wanted to get as far west as they could get, away from the slave culture of the South, and still be inside the Treaty of Stanwix. And they wanted to settle where there was a mill. And Richmond, Indiana has a river called the White River that is the perfect location for a mill. So that's why Richmond, Indiana is the heart of Friends United Meeting today. But these young people, their friends, were in the midst of a great revival. There were these revival meetings taking place all over the West. And they saw the emotional involvement, they saw the excitement, and they heard all these new ideas. So they petitioned their meetings for permission to have special meetings that would allow singing and would allow other people to preach besides the recorded ministers. And the very first one they had was attended by hundreds of people, and it was a huge success. And this was the beginning of a steady movement through the 1870s into the 1880s towards program worship, and ultimately towards pastors, paid pastors, which had, we had one of our first revolutionary claims was that the only qualification for the ministry was to be called into it by the Holy Spirit. You didn't need to be taught in a school. You didn't need to get ordained. You just had to have the Spirit. But the culture of the time, the economic pressures on farming at the time and so on, made it very difficult to be an active minister in the old Quaker way and keep your business or your farm going. And so they began paying people whose job it was to be their pastor. The very first pastoral meeting was in Glens Falls, New York. And by the 1880s, the movement had shifted decisively in this direction. And they decided to hold a conference to settle some of the fighting that was going on about how far they should go. The really important question was, should we baptize people? The Richmond Conference of 1887 settled many of these questions more or less for more or less of the movement. And they wrote a doctrinal document called the Richmond Declaration, which the Hicksites said was essentially a creed. And it sort of was. the reaction to this was quite strong, and especially in England, which had remained evangelical but had never divided. They were, a lot of these evangelical friends in America, in Great Britain, were somewhat horrified by what they saw at the Richmond conference. Rufus Jones was one of the Americans who sort of agreed with them, even though he had grown up in an Orthodox meeting in Maine. These young Turks in England were equally dissatisfied with the quality of the vocal ministry and equally dissatisfied with the dominance of the culture by these old fogies as they saw them. So they decided they were going to have their own conference, and they organized what's called the Manchester Conference in 1895. And although most of the organizers were actually evangelical, most of the speakers were part of a new movement of liberal friends, of whom the guiding lights were Rufus Jones in America and John Wilhelm Rowntree in Great Britain. Rowntree was part of the Rowntree chocolate family. And his grandfather had been a key figure in the middle of the century. In 1858, the decline of Quakerism in Great Britain was so scary to so many people that an anonymous friend posted a 100-pound award for the essay that best explained what was happening and provided the best solution to the problem. And John Wilhelm's grandfather, John Stevenson Rowntree, won that prize at the age, I believe, of 28, with an essay called Quakerism Past and Present. And his solution was, his analysis was, you're reading people out of meeting for buying pianos and marrying Presbyterians. Why are you doing that? Overnight, by 1861, London Yearly Meeting revised its Book of Discipline and stopped disowning people for all these minor infractions of the discipline, and reversed the course of decline in Great Britain. But these young people wanted to take things farther, and there was a lot of support in the wider society. The progressive movement had gotten going in the 1890s. The Pentecostal movement was born in the 1890s. And the social gospel movement was born in the 1890s. There are all these things happening that basically said, well, the point source of the problem was, in a way, aside from the desire for relevant vocal ministry, was the theory of evolution. These young people wanted a relevant religion that accepted the theory of evolution and embraced all of the incredible insights, breakthroughs that were taking place in the physical sciences at the time. And so they wanted, and the scientific revolution had invaded biblical studies. They loved the Bible, they wanted the Bible, but they wanted to study the Bible with these new tools that had been developed first by the Germans that brought scientific criticism to the study of the Bible. And thus was born what we now call liberal Quakerism. It grew as a kind of movement until the Great War. And then they were radicalized. For the first time since the Lamb's War, the state was persecuting Quakers, because there were an awful lot of friends in America, but especially in Great Britain, young men who were refusing to serve in the war. And a conscientious objection status had not been clearly established yet. So lots of Quakers went to jail. Lots of Quakers joined the army. It was but the conflict over what to do raised the peace testimony up as the signature testimony that we now think of it as today. And it also spread out. Suddenly testimony mattered. Suddenly young people are saying, well, what do we stand for after all? And how are we going to change this world to make it a better place? And this all culminates in the creation of the American Friends Service Committee and the British Friends Service Committee during World War I to start off with, to man ambulance crews on the front. All of this finally comes to a head in 1920 with the first World Conference of Friends. And there's so much, there's a lot of detail to go into, or there's a lot of, we could say more about the 20th century. I just want to drop in on a couple of highlights and then go back to Greg to talk, if he wants to, a little bit about AFSC, which is his specialty.
Yeah. Go ahead.
The 20th century sees an explosion of Quaker organizations. AFSC is sort of the first, and Friends, I forget what it's called in Great Britain. Greg will know. But then I believe just after World War II, Friends Committee on National Legislation is formed. The Quaker United Nations office is formed. Evangelical Friends Alliance is formed. The evangelicals finally formed their own organization right after the Second World War. A couple of organizations spring up in Europe. And Friends World Committee for Consultation gets formed, I believe, in the middle of the 1930s. Intended to become a body that embraces all Quakers regardless of the branches you're in. And then in 1967, Right Sharing of World Resources is born in the middle of the Friends World Conference held that year at Guilford College in North Carolina, or is it South Carolina? I can never remember which state it's in. So, Greg, you want to say something more about?
No, I'm always eager to talk about the American Friends Service Committee. You mentioned Rufus Jones. He was sort of the 19th century Mr. Philadelphia Quaker, or the 20th century, early 20th century. Just as in the 19th century, we speak of Lucretia Mott as being sort of the epic Quaker of the day. He was behind the foundation, not only the AFSC, but Pendle Hill. But I got very excited about the AFSC and wrote the centennial history of it. And I have sent an excerpt to everybody. Jones and his several colleagues from Little Haverford College out here in the suburbs basically established the AFSC in 1917 to provide alternative service for conscientious objectors. Because it was government approved, it had to include also other faiths. There were Mennonites, Brethren, Jews, Catholics, and Methodists, and their task was to rebuild France as the Germans were pushed back. And so they did, but they were best known for the AFSC was best known for its feeding programs after the war, because it fed both the defeated and the victors. This is in both world wars. And in 1947, the AFSC won the Nobel Peace Prize along with the British Friends Service Council. And see, the name kept changing, so we'll just call it FSC for right now. And it was mainly for feeding in Germany and elsewhere in Europe. The hero, the Quaker hero of the day, and you haven't heard this said very often, was Herbert Hoover. But I'll leave you to ask that question later if you want to. They also fed the Russians after the Bolshevik Revolution, when there was tremendous starvation in Russia. The AFSC stories in the early years of its existence are dramatic and heartrending. I can't even say anything about Eleanor Roosevelt helping the AFSC feed the Appalachian miners during the Depression. But its iconic activity, I'm going to talk a bit about this, in its first 50 years, was probably work in the Spanish Civil War. Let me read a bit from an excerpt I sent to you. The AFSC, with allies including the FSC, the British, and other peace churches, undertook one of its most original path-breaking efforts to enter a country engaged in a civil war and provide relief to both sides on a strictly neutral basis. The recognized Republican government, this is in Spain, gave its approval, but much ground clearing of other sorts needed doing, justifying the effort to the nationalist insurgents, raising funds, gathering food and clothing supplies into the warehouses, seeking approval from US government agencies, and rebuilding alliances with old partners such as the Red Cross, the Federal Council of Churches, the Mennonites, the Brethren, and various Save the Children organizations. So imagine this, a small group of British Quakers located in the southeast of Spain, I think Valencia probably, and American Quakers over in the northwest, fed civilians behind the lines, retreating or advancing with the armies. As Franco began to win, Franco, the nationalists, the fascists, the AFSC then began funneling Republicans across the border to AFSC refugee camps in France. It's a wonderful story. I may be getting carried away, so that's what I wanted to say, Steve.
I want to add one more thing about the overarching, the arc of Quaker history, and that is that in the beginning, in the 1650s, Friends assaulted the social order through what's called the Lamb's War in indirect ways, with this idea of hat honor, that you wouldn't tip your hat to people of higher social standing when you passed them on the street, which was a day in, day out, in your face kind of confrontational thing. And the same with plain speech, addressing everyone the same way, not addressing your social betters in a different way, and so on. But all of that was sort of, it was the result of their religious impulse. It wasn't an attempt to actually change society as such. And then Friends withdrew completely from that project in the 18th century. And they returned in some ways, especially through philanthropy in the 19th century. But at the turn of the 20th century, Friends became finally again focused on systemic change of the social order. Not just trying to minister to the people that it hurt through alms and philanthropic support, but actually trying to change the way the system worked itself. The hero of that for me is a fellow named Seabohm Rowntree, who was John Wilhelm Rowntree's brother, but I'm not going to get into him. It's just that you can draw a straight line from the book he wrote called Poverty, the Study of a Town Life, to the creation of the welfare state in Great Britain. He's almost single-handedly responsible for turning British Quakerism towards systemic social change. By proving that people were poor not because they were drinking and having too much sex and gambling too much and hanging out at the pub, but because they weren't being paid enough. And AFSC followed a similar arc. It started off as a service committee and is now probably more famous as an advocacy committee. A committee focused on making systemic change in the world, and that's often how we think of the testimonial life of Friends today, but this was an innovation around the turn of the 20th century. All right, that's a heavy down dump. Let me take a deep breath and see if Friends have questions or themes that they would like to return to.
Steve, I didn't really feel I understood the transition from the persecution of the Quakers to their becoming so wealthy. I know that one of the explanations was that people could trust their pricing, but how did Quakers move from that level of society where they started to being what we would call upper middle class? And what's the explanation for all the inventions and all the things that you focused on that Quakers were able to do during that time?
The persecutions, especially the law that required you to take an oath of loyalty to do almost anything, including going to college, meant that the only thing left to the Friends was the area of commerce. And the Great Britain had what you could call a mercantile capitalist economy at the time. The British West Indies Company was chartered by the Crown in 1600, I think it was, under Elizabeth. And this was the beginning of state control of a new kind of economy that wasn't just about the wealth that the land in Great Britain produced under the manorial system, which is, the landed aristocracy and the gentry of Great Britain. They were wealthy because they owned land and they collected rents from the serfs and the peasants that worked their land. And that was the basis of their wealth. This was 1600 saw the birth of a commercial capitalism in which the money to be made now was in international trade: spice, tea, and wool. The British textile industry was the backbone of its own productivity in this new economy. And soon added cotton because of the slave trade and the cotton in North America. And so Friends were forced into an industry that was exploding just at the point at which it was really getting off the ground. There was, have a company then, you had to be chartered by the Crown. But these laws got loosened up later in the 17th century, and it became possible for smaller factors to get involved in the economy. And so they were at the beginnings of a booming economy. They're in the middle of a booming economy at just the point at which it was about to become automated. And the exact fulcrum has always eluded me. I don't really have a good answer because the numbers are so extraordinary. The Industrial Revolution doesn't really get off the ground for, until deeper into the 18th century. But they started all these new industries that we sort of take for granted today. For instance, the British porcelain industry was started by Quakers. I'm sorry to say that I've been trying to track the specific thing down and haven't been able to. What happened in the 1690s and the 17s and the 17 teens to start this up? I think it must have been the weaving factories, the wool weaving factories putting out the wool that they had been raising as sheep beforehand, and the trade. But I can't confirm that the wool trade was actually that robust at that time. And I'm going to keep searching until I get a better answer to that question. I understand very well where the wealth came from later in the decade, in the century. It's just astounding how many. I like to say that the Industrial Revolution would have taken place without Quakers, but it didn't. We were the Industrial Revolution to a large degree in the 18th and early 19th century.
Well, I wonder if Margot's wondering why. Did they continue not to take loyalty oaths and all the rest of it? And didn't they continue to be fined and their goods restrained and stuff after they became commercial.
They did, yeah. The Quakers were, the law that finally made it okay for dissenters not to pay tithes was passed in 1859. So Friends were still paying tithe fines deep into the 19th century. It was, all of this was administered at the parish level. So it sort of depended on who the rector of your parish was, or who the magistrates were. It was the tithe fine apparatus was very decentralized. The oath taking, I believe, was lifted at the same time. I think it was 1859. So it was only after 1859 that Quakers were allowed to go to the Quaker schools. Joseph John Gurney, that we've mentioned as the evangelical who missionized evangelicalism in America in the 1840s, he was his bank, the Bank of Norwich, was the second largest bank in England after the Bank of England, and he went to Cambridge, but he wasn't allowed to attend classes, so he paid for private tutors.
Oh.
Lauren?
Earlier, I said something about the movement of Quakers. It was right around when you were talking about the evangelical movement within Quakers. Was something before that, Greg, where maybe we were moving away from, it had to do with advices. And I had the sense that you were saying that we've kind of moved away from that to being more directive or disciplined. I'm not sure if I got that right.
I don't recall the word advices. Oh, wait a minute, this was back in England.
Yes.
The Alby Declaration sort of gave birth to the idea of the testimonies, which are not dogma, thou shalt not, but integrity, honesty, simplicity. It's not in there, but I sort of think it's that sense that possibly made Quakerism a little more popular, being we just suggest that you follow the spirit of the idea and not the letter of the law.
That was in the 1650s.
1656.
The first book of discipline was written in 1710. And I think that there were formal advices and maybe queries at the same time. Originally, the advices and the queries were managed at the quarterly meeting level. And the quarters meeting of ministers and elders would write up a series of queries, send them to the local meetings, and local meetings would then visit individual families and ask these questions. And then they would bring a report back to the quarter, and the quarter would then decide on its discipline. And then draft a bunch of advices based on the results they'd gotten from their moral surveys, basically. And this was the system that operated until the middle of the 19th century. Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, I believe, stopped recording ministers in 1720, and I think it stopped recording elders sometime before that. Did I say 1720? I meant 1920.
I'd just like to, yeah, I would like to guess that in response to Margot's question and Steve's not being able to pin it down, that in some ways it sounds as if the Quakers were there at the right time in history.
Exactly.
I mean, that's a broad stroke.
Yes, and they were there at the right time with the right things. First of all, they didn't have any choice. They had to do what they were doing. It was the only option they had. But also there were these aspects of Quaker culture that really helped. Max Weber's famous book, what's it, something in the Protestant Ethic, The Rise of Capitalism and the Protestant Ethic, mentions Quakers several times. We were sort of we were exactly what he was talking about. That the Quakers, along with the Puritans, understood one's work in the world as a religious calling. This was an innovation. What you did in the world was something God had called you to do. And therefore it was to be done as a religious calling. It was to be done with a new level of seriousness and attention to moral imperative. And it prepared friends for the kind of commercial life they had been thrown into, especially when it came to integrity, diligence, industry, a sense of vocation and of service, prudence and debt. One of the things you could be read out of meeting for was going bankrupt. Elizabeth Fry, who was Joseph John Gurney's sister, who was the famous prison reformer, her husband went bankrupt. Mr. Fry went bankrupt, and he was read out of meeting. And so she was a disowned friend for a little while. If you got your act together after some time, I think it took 10 years, the meeting took Mr. Fry back into membership again. But they argued about it for a long time because Elizabeth Fry was a Gurney. This was it was a big move to disown her or her husband, because he was like the Quaker of his age. Although he himself, he ran an investment firm that went catastrophically bankrupt in the 1870s, I think, after he died. They got overextended and the bank crashed, and it was a disaster. But he almost went bankrupt in a Great Depression of 1828. And so in his journal, he talks about how this threw him into a period of desperate moral self-reflection. What about his character had let him get into this kind of trouble?
I can just interject, Steve. There are so many examples of Quakers behaving badly, right from 1700 through the splits and so on. For example, being read out of meeting for being bankrupt, but also for marrying in front of a minister, a paid minister, a hireling minister, marrying anybody who was not of your particular Quaker faith, and locking people out of meeting because they didn't see things the same way you did. Just too many examples. And that may be one of the reasons our membership has gone down from 40,000 to 10,000.
I have a question about the term quietist and the quietist period. In where does the name come from, and why was it considered to be a quietist period? And does it suggest that there was less activism at that time? Let me pair that with a question, because we're talking about the pre-revolutionary period in the United States, 1700 to 1776. John Woolman's life. Is John Woolman considered to be this great Quaker of that period because he was so different from everybody else? Or were there a number of other people who were similarly activist as John Woolman was?
That's for you, Steve. I have the same question. What does it really mean, quietism?
There's been a lively debate about whether Quakers really were quietists. And the answer seems to be not quite. On the continent, the Quietists were the Anabaptists, almost the same thing as the Anabaptists. That is to say, the spiritual life is completely internal. The corporate religious life is to be pared down to its bare minimum. It's complete reliance on the inner life, the inner experience of Christ, as opposed to the evangelical approach, which is which focuses on sin and the atonement of the cross as the solution, or to put it in the sort of classic categories of theology, you're justified by faith in Christ, and then you're sanctified. You're made a better person afterwards by the activity of the Holy Spirit. And the Quietists said, no, that's backwards. First, there's the Holy Spirit. You're justified by the Holy Spirit. It's the inward experience of the Spirit that brings you salvation, and not faith in some outward act of Christ. And so you can see how this is very close to the Quaker idea of perfectionism, in which salvation is not faith in Christ's death and resurrection on your behalf, but the day in, day out activity of Christ in your heart to help you overcome temptation. And so it wasn't like you're saved and then that's that, and now you try to be a better person. It's that you're always in it. You're always facing temptation, and you're always turning toward the light to show you your temptation and help you overcome it. That's the point of contact with the Quietists. But the Quakers brought in the church in a way that the Quietists didn't. The corporate dimension of the Quaker faith, and especially the gathered meeting, I would say, the corporate experience of the Holy Spirit, made this not just a totally personal, internal affair. And it did have this outward facing outlet that Bob referred to, which is sort of immortalized in the work of John Woolman. The Spirit could tell you to do things in the world. And the Quietists were just staying in their little Quietist bubble. And so it is that phrase that Rufus Jones coined, I think, describes the difference. Quakerism became a practical mysticism, not just a mysticism. It was a world facing. Culturally, especially in the 18th century, we did withdraw, but we still had our John Woolmans. Now, I think he stands alone in the degree to which he reached out to others, but most of his ministry was actually to other Quakers. He was trying to get Quakers to stop owning slaves, and he was addressing Quakers. This is a kind of where we are in the Quietist impulse still, is that it continued to be, it was outward facing in this way, but it also there was still a bubble.
I wonder if I could add something to this, especially for the benefit of the new people. Next session is supposed to be on Quaker theology. and other related things. So I think it will complement what you've heard today. I think Bob's question really was brilliant about John Woolman, but many of the new people probably haven't had a chance to read John Woolman or heard much about him. So I'm feeling there is a gap here for people who are asking more basic questions and those who are asking basic questions through a lot of depth with terms that not everyone is aware of. I'm wondering how to break through that. One thought is that if we do focus more on theology next time, we will look at what people believe today and how that affects the way we go about our lives as Quakers. The history section today actually had a lot of things about how people believe today and how it affects our life today, but it might not be apparent to some of the newest people. If I were a new person and I went to a session like we had today and heard the expertise in history, it might scare me a little bit, because I would say, wow, are all Quakers like Steve Davison and Greg Barnes? Does everybody ask questions like Bob Sutton? How do they throw all these terms around? How do people know so much? And I want to say to the new people, I feel that you stumbled into a richness that doesn't exist in a lot of meetings. You could have a Quakerism101 course in the 90%, 80, 75% of the meetings in this area, and you would not get these riches. And you wouldn't have as many older members showing up as the newer people, because there's a high degree of level of interest in history in this meeting. Why are we interested? History is a place where we come together with beliefs and with a wider sociological, historical, political perspective. And we need both. We are so fortunate to have people with historical expertise, because that will put our faith in context. I'm remembering when I was in college and I had to take a course about the history of ideas. And I hated the course because at that time I was convinced that the only thing that mattered was social class and issues of justice and issues of who was the owner and who had no chance to progress in the society. That was my interest. And I really felt like ideas didn't matter that much. So I don't want anybody to feel like if we're talking about history the way we are today, and we're talking about Quakers participating in the great historical movements of the past several centuries, that we're saying that beliefs that we have today don't matter, but the other opposite thing isn't true either. That all we care about is what your personal beliefs are, and we don't care whether Quakers were rich or powerful or how they handled the conflicts of having power back in those days. So just to finish a comment, I think that John Woolman was a person who wedded the two perfectly. He was so deep in the way he thought about things that even today, if you read what he said, you're saying, wow, that sounds fresh and new. He thought about slavery in ways that nobody else did, because he had a really deep life of grounded reflection. And he didn't force it on anybody. He didn't get it from anybody. He got it in himself. And then he had all these insights that led him to produce a journal that we still read that's amazing. But his deep inner life led him to be aware of the sociological dynamics of slavery and not want to purchase goods produced by slaves. That was a new insight. So he had both. Our meetings have a Steve and a Greg. we're very fortunate, who really give a depth of years of reflecting on these historical questions. Everybody isn't like that, nor does everybody put a lot of energy into their personal faith. Some people put a lot more energy into figuring out what's going on right now in our country and in the global situation and with sustainability. So I guess I'm ending by saying, I hope we go deeper into Bob's question next time about what quietism is and isn't, and how a word from the past affects our faith today and our activism today. How history informs personal belief, and the big guys who made the headlines are affected by the little ones who nobody knew about, who wrote a journal or who lived a life of integrity. And we're really lucky to get this introduction with so much depth.
A quick follow on to that is, it sounded like many of these Quakers were young and that revolutionary, and they revolutionized the Society of Quakers periodically, like with movement in Illinois and with AFSC. And so I'm kind of looking forward to the next revolution. It seems timely.
Every renewal movement in Quaker history has been led by young adults. Fox had his first vision at the age of 24 and began his ministry at the age of 28. John Stevenson Roundtree was in his 20s when he wrote the essay that turned the London Yearly Meeting around in the 1850s. The pastoral and program tradition began as a young adult demand for change. Liberal Quakerism, 2 decades later, grew up out of the same exact kind of impulse. Young adults who were sort of fed up with the ossification of Quaker culture and wanted something more lively and more relevant to the modern time. Yeah, I agree with you. I'm praying for a young adult movement in the 21st century to show us the new, the next revolution in Quaker culture.
I have, I know it's pretty late and it's probably a subject unto itself, but the role of women to me is really fascinated me, and was one of the things that really drew me to Quakerism, is that women had much more of a prominent role, much more of an egalitarian status. Not that there weren't differences in the way things were set up with business meeting, and there was a strong social structure and historical roles, but I've wondered about how that happened. Was it a natural evolution? Was there some kind of mini revolution within Quakerism that Quaker women stood up? Or I'm just not sure how it happened, but it's so pronounced to me, the role of women in this faith, that I find so rare.
It is pronounced. It starts, I think, with Margaret Fell, but there are just many other threads to trace it along. And the meetings were segregated, you know, the business meetings, women's meeting and men's meeting, but they did have a sort of parity. And by 1928, women were I think you could say, equal with men in meeting.
I would adjust what Greg just said slightly, because there were friends, women, who felt called by the Spirit into various ministries before Margaret Fell, or contemporary with Margaret Fell, but Fell cemented it in a way when she wrote a pamphlet about it. She wrote a famous pamphlet whose title I do not now remember, basically answering all of the arguments that their contemporaries had against women speaking in meeting. Then now you could hold something up and say, well, this is why you don't understand what Paul meant when he said, etc. And it went beyond just cementing the role of women in the ministry, it helped define the Quaker understanding of how to approach literature, the Bible. It's sort of a cornerstone of what we now call continuing revelation. That okay, Paul said women shouldn't speak in meeting, but this broke open an all new way to approach the Bible that had been unavailable before friends came along, and Fell and Barclay are the two who really showed the way in this regard. If you go to some of the older meeting houses, like Manasquan Meeting and Shrewsbury Meeting in New Jersey, which were built in the 19th century, they still have dividing walls in their meeting room with sliding accordion doors that used to separate the women's from the men's meeting. And nowadays, those meetings keep the sliding doors rolled out so that there's just one meeting room, but you can still see the architectural device in place.
Yeah, Plymouth Meeting has that also.
Yes.
The dividing.
If I may,
Central Philadelphia, the Cherry Street room was the women's meeting. I've been told.
If I may, there's one little, I don't think of it as a detail, actually, that's why I'm bringing it up, that I missed when I was tracking Quaker fortunes. And that is to explain why, it's sort of the flip side to what Margot's question was. Why, when Quakers were one of the most wealthy communities in all of Great Britain, are they all middle class now? What happened? In both America and especially in Great Britain, limited liability law started in the 1860s, but in both countries, the breakthroughs took place in the higher courts in the 1890s, which finally settled the opportunity for regular people to start a corporation easily and limit the liability of the shareholders for the debts of the corporation, so that shareholders could not be held accountable if the corporation went bankrupt. And gradually, all of the great Quaker family-owned corporations, which had been family-owned, became publicly owned. They had IPOs and went public. And Lever Brothers and the Bank of Norwich and Lloyd's of London and all these, the Cadbury Chocolate Company, they all went public. And the younger people in the families were faced with the choice of becoming managers in companies their families had once owned, or leaving business altogether and doing something else. And over the decades of the early decades of the 20th century, all the great Quaker family fortunes began to decline. And then, especially beginning after the war, there were this huge influx of convinced friends who came straight out of the middle class, the middle class. And that's where we are today. Any other questions?
I don't have a question, but I would like just to thank you and everyone here. I did not really felt like overwhelmed. No, sorry, I did not feel like pressed or like too much pressure. Like because of all this knowledge, I really felt like blessed to be here and see everyone's interest. But I did feel a little bit overwhelmed with the amount of information, and like I want to know, like I think I could spend hours and like here, but So yeah, just thank you. Yeah.
I would love to second that as well. Thank you so much, everybody.
Well, you're welcome. I think we might want to think about having a kind of follow-up session in which we just answer questions and explore ideas, explore specifics, so we can dig a little deeper into some of this stuff.
I think it's very rare that any religious group looks at its class analysis, its class origins, its class makeup through the centuries, and its current class makeup. But that's something that is very active among friends, and there are lots of new articles coming out that people are writing with new insights about the effects of our class analysis. Just the other day, someone said to me, there is an extremely exciting article in Friends Journal about class issues today among friends. This is the intellectual energy of our society that is still going on. And most other churches or other non-Christian religious groups that you would join would not do class analysis historically or currently, but look at the riches at being willing to look at our weaknesses and our strengths based on our class position. This shows the intellectual vigor to me, and I'm excited about it.
We've had a number of important political economists amongst our membership too. The most famous is probably Herbert Hoover. But then there's Kenneth Boulding, who was a major economist of the late 20th century, who created the field of peace studies as an academic discipline, who created the field of ecological economics, and who was a very early pioneer of systems theory, ways to integrate the social sciences into one system of understanding. And then there's a lesser known figure named Jack Powelson, who was for decades an advisor to the Chinese government on globalization. He's one of the architects of the expansion of the Chinese economy, and a very controversial figure because he's a champion of globalization. And then there's Bayard Rustin, who organized the march in 1968, and A.J. Muste, who was an early 1930s, 1940s labor leader. So we have a rich history of people who have been involved directly in the development of economic ideas. Well, friends, thank you. We have our next session. Well, there's two things going on. Next in October, in this slot, the fourth Sunday of the month in the afternoon session, George Leakey will be talking about the work that he's been doing to prepare for the possibility of disturbances around the election. So I invite friends to come to that. And the following Saturday, October 24th, is planned to be our next Quakerism 101 session. And we had originally planned a morning session, as Helene mentioned, on theology and spirituality and the Quaker approach to the Bible. And in the afternoon, it was to be on Quaker worship. Unfortunately, we've been having problems getting facilitators organized for the afternoon session. So look for updates on that particular session. But I think the morning is to be counted on. And we'll be sending out notices, and we'll be providing a reading list for friends who want to look into it ahead of time. And I hope you all can come and spread the word. Also, I plan to be a little more energetic about inviting friends from outside our meeting. I want to invite the rest of the quarter at least, and I'm going to try to communicate with some of the meetings in the nearby suburbs as well to see if we can swell our numbers a little bit.
As one of the people preparing on Quaker theology, I will be thinking about what we said about the class origins and the class issues within the Religious Society of Friends historically and currently. So we could ask, how does our social class affect our beliefs and the way that we experience faith as individuals and as a community? So class will be part of our thinking for the next session.
So finally, thanks again, friends. And
Well,
have a good day. Thanks, Greg. It's been great to collaborate with you.
same here, Steve.
Thank you. It's been rich.
Thank you.
Go in peace.
Thanks,
Go up and serve the Lord.
It had to be said.
I'm leaving.